State. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies were stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. All right, so today's myth is a continuation of the last episode, but we're going to change the myth title just slightly. So instead of radical woke DEI, the myth is DEI has radical roots, because we get more into the history in this episode. So we're going to deal with some of the earlier affirmative action history, integrationist history that precedes DEI, and how that history and all its complications lays the framework for what DEI emerges out of, even though a lot of them don't really, the people who are in those fields don't give enough credit to it, for good or for better or worse. So it's still me, Ryan, and Rasul. We had this gap in a week because of the conference planning. So that the conference, the National Black Radical Organizing Conference, that just was concluded last weekend here in Indianapolis. I think we did a good job. Everything wasn't perfect, and you're going to hear plenty of people will love to point that out, but I'm proud of the team and everything that we were able to do. You know, we didn't have billions of resources, but I think it ran smoothly for the most part. People were able to interact and make the connections. Our organizations were able to meet some of our objectives, and we'll be doing a debrief. So it was great to see some of y'all there. I know I was probably moving around a lot because I was a point person, so I wasn't able to talk with some of y'all as much as I would have liked. So for that, I apologize, but I appreciate everybody came out. We had a great turnout. I think most people enjoyed themselves, and you know, the chit chatter is going to be what it is. I'm not really going to get much into that. But we'll find ways to improve. It's already an improvement from the last conference, and we'll continue to do that. If you do want to hear some debriefing, we might do some on Patreon, something of that nature, those of us who are involved from the local perspective. But if you want to hear something's already been done on Life Study Revolution with Dr. CBS and Layla Brown, Dr. Layla Brown, I was on there with a few of the organizers, Erica, and then also some attendees to discuss it if you want to hear more about why certain choices were made and things of that nature. But I think overall, we as a people need to focus more on logistics. I think people get so caught up on ideas that the how to do things is not really clear for folks. So it's just a lot of suggestions that they have no clue how they need to be implemented. We just got to get better at that. But I think overall the conference was great, and I'm proud of what we did, and I stand on that. For whatever things we didn't get right, I apologize. Lastly, to the patrons, again, I appreciate for y'all who've been staying up with us, because man, the conference definitely took a lot out of our ability to stay organized on this side of things. But I do want to shout out those who have joined over the last, I guess, month since I've posted anything. So shout out to Joel Gossams, shout out to HF Clittenberg, shout out to Natalie Johnson, Caitlin Brown, Reveille, I probably didn't say your name right, I apologize. Laura Too Dope, who else? Nadia S., Alex Mekendall. Look like we had a decent amount of people sign up, and that's not even naming the free members. So thank you for those who continue to step up. I think with this conference being concluded and just doing some of the debriefing and stuff, this show will come back to its be a little bit more consistent than I think it's been the last few months. But so definitely shout out to all of y'all for sticking with us, and despite our time being very challenged between, personal stuff that everybody's got to deal with on top of just, organizing responsibilities. So anyway, we're going to get into this. We start off with, again, it's me, Ryan, and Rasul. We start off with thinking about um, the early days of integrationist attempts within the United States government, particularly in the starting in post World War II, and how there was a national security interest in advancing so-called civil rights, and that there was this, as Derek Bell talks about, this interest convergence between the state and black folks who were interested in the kind of integrationist approach, and that is, partially what helps push forward some of those efforts. So get into that, and we'll see y'all next, hopefully sometime later this month.
Hmm.
To kind of get to some of the history. So in the book, so we talked about soft power, hard power, but another way to think about early, like pre-DEI, DEI, is integration. And because that is literally well, not literally, but it's a form of inclusion, even though that chart I showed y'all earlier tries to claim that integration and inclusion are supposedly different, but not in practice. So so there's a book we reference in the piece, The Minority Rights Revolution by John Scretany. It's a great book. I had a chance to read more of it even after we wrote it, just to get a better sense of some of the stuff in there. And he walks through thinking about thinking about integration as a form of black, and particularly of black people, as a form of national security. So because at the time there is this we're talking about the 40s primarily, and the Roosevelt administration, and really even some of the late 30s. But up to that point, the idea of like human rights and everybody being equal really wasn't predominantly an idea. I think people kind of forget about that. Like if you go to the League of Nations, that was like the formation prior to the United Nations. That was mainly a Western thing, and they literally rejected an equality statement. That was under like Woodrow Wilson coming out of the World War One. So the idea of people being equal was not a regular concept that might be hard for people to think about, like not even as a front or as an idea people lie about. Like it wasn't popular to say that everybody was created equal. That was not how it was. Very much, white people or certain Europeans were above others, and this is during an era of outright colonialism, not abstract, like literal colonialism and Jim Crow and all of that. Like, and it was mainly accepted across the world. I mean, obviously there's always going to be resistance, but that was accepted. And the World War II and Hitler and Japan became, that we can get deep into that too. But like the way Hitler's, some people say Hitler's real sin was he turned what the European world did on the on the dark world, and he turned it on Europe, and that was his real sin, when he thought he could do that to the rest of his people, and they were like, nah, that's too far. So there were intellectuals at the time who were starting to see like we need to have a different framework, this what we now call this rules-based, international order that's complete BS now. So there was like British author H.G. Wells began to promote the concept of international Declaration of Human Rights, and he was able to influence people like President Roosevelt. We're only naming presidents on this episode, not in our writings. Well, so so in October of 1840, he pushed the idea as a war aimed to Roosevelt and others. So the idea of entering World War II was framed as a defense of human rights, which was, again, that's not like we think that that's always how it's been, but that's not necessarily how things were framed. I mean, you can look back like I think the Berlin Conference, sometimes they'll claim retroactively that they ended slavery, and there was like propaganda to end slavery so they could do the colonialism and shit like that. But you want to end slavery, do colonialism. You know what I mean? So it's like, um, so Roosevelt gave a speech the United States. He said he wanted to give a new international meaning by declaring the United States to be in the arsenal of democracy. And this is where you really start to hear this upturn of like America is this beacon of hope and for everyone. Like again, that literature has existed in ways, because obviously even in the Constitution they talk about it, but it's pretty clear that they don't actually mean everybody in that literature. This is like the first time where they're trying to at least say we mean everybody. So as of early, and I'm quoting out of this book, these are not my words, but as early as June 1945, so this is now Harry Truman, the president that comes after Roosevelt. He wrote in his diary, he was talking about how, so before I quote that, so they're promoting themselves as this bastion of hope, but they do have Jim Crow. The United States has Jim Crow, and then coming and then so a lot of times people talk about the Soviet propaganda, but even the Nazis and the Japanese were hitting the United States on their racial, apartheid and using that as a way to talk down. So even the fascists were making fun of the United States and using it as a way to knock the United States. And it started to become a problem for the United States as like, oh, we have this contradiction while we're trying to expand as an empire. This is a real problem, right? So integration and and the expansion of like non-discrimination laws became a means of national security, because it's a means of like how can we expand imperially as an empire while we're doing these things at the same time. It just becomes hard to sell yourself to nations that you're trying to push to decolonize. Because another thing we know that's, I don't think is in my notes, but Roosevelt, when he wanted to go out and sell this stuff to the world, he also pushes Winston Churchill, who was the prime minister of the UK, to come out and talk about human rights, which is hilarious if you know anything about Winston Churchill. But he, so Winston Churchill does this, and even the British, and a lot of this is in our book. They say, okay, we're gonna like Roosevelt kind of pushes him to, okay, we're gonna do kind of a decolonizing. We're gonna let go of our colonies formally. They really had to. Like this wasn't a matter of them being nice. They had just gotten asked. Like a lot of these motherfuckers was dying in World War II. Like we're talking about millions of people. They couldn't hold on to colonies no more anyway. You know, so that was kind of inevitable. But so they're doing that, but at the same time they still have this contradiction. So it's, we're coming back to Truman. He wrote in his diary, propaganda seems to be our greatest foreign relations enemy. Russians distribute lies about us. And then it's noted in the book in the early 1950s, the State Department estimated that nearly half of Soviet propaganda was on racial equality. So the United States is losing this war of trying to sell capitalism and democracy as opposed to, communism. And they're losing this Cold War, or they're afraid they're going to lose this Cold War. So we need to get rid of these, we need to get rid of some of this nonsense at home. So there's initiative taken by the State Department and the White House primarily in this era. And it's important to know while this is happening, we did not say this on millennial capitalism. While this is happening, the Red Scare is happening.
Hmm.
So McCarthyism, as people call it, is happening at the same time. So 1946, um, the frequently cited later civil rights activist, acting Secretary of State Dean Acheson communicated the national security implications of equal rights, that the existence of discrimination against minority groups in the United States is a handicap to our relations with other countries. So again, we're not making this up. This is in their literature. But
Yeah.
they're also repressing, communists and people who aren't even communists, people who might be loosely associated with it. It became this overreach of the state. They're also, putting Du Bois on trial, taking Paul Robeson's,
Hmm.
ability to travel, kicking Claudia Jones and others out of the country, taking communists out of unions. This is happening at the exact same time. So they're talking all of this discrimination and all of it. But so again, that's why they see it as a form of national security. So for them, this isn't even a contradiction. The fact that they're doing all this repression while they're trying to expand rights. So you saw like the State Department would, hire more people, hire more black people into the State Department. They started having black people becoming diplomats that they could send across the world into different countries. A. Philip Randolph and other activists used this kind of tone to force the military to integrate, to force the State Department to hire more black people. There's memos like this stuff is referenced in our book too about how the State Department would pressure Hollywood to have less stereotypical roles for black people in movies during this period. So let's not just make them all butlers, or something like that. Like let's give them more respectable roles. We
Mm,
already talked about the State Department sending people across the world to play jazz, and things of that nature. So it's a form of national security, and it's like integration was a kind of pre-DEI in that sense, right? Like you are trying to sell it. They're also arguing in the Justice Department, particularly under Truman, and even in Eisenhower's case, they're arguing in favor of certain civil rights claims, to get rid of racially restrictive covenants, and we know about the Brown versus Board, and this was
right.
primarily done up until the '60s. There really wasn't a lot
So
of legislation. This was done through the executive, base. So it's interesting we're in a period now where the executive is trying to reassert its power. A lot of this
mhm.
was done through the executive. This was not done and the courts. It wasn't done through legislation until, there was a few weak legislations in the 50s, and then the 60s where you get your actual breakthrough legislations. But up until that point, this is primarily within Truman and even in Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson to Nixon. That kind of all those presidents saw this as a type of national security and advanced the cause to some extent of civil rights for
Hmm.
better or worse,
So
because it
kind of
was,
like
yeah.
make themselves look better on the international stage, but at the same time continue the repression at home.
Because the
And
repression at home and internationally,
yeah,
because again,
and
they're
internationally.
also meddling in all these countries, right?
That's true. You're right.
They're
Yeah.
overthrowing people who even remotely had even the slightest sensibility or
Hmm.
sympathy for socialist policies, even if they weren't socialist,
And
even if they just wanted to nationalize their resources and use them, like in Guatemala or
yeah,
Iran. These were not socialist leaders, but the fact that they wanted to do things that were at least a little bit left leaning, they were overthrown often at the behest of corporations that existed in those countries that didn't want their shit appropriated. So
again, the
Lumumba
soft
even
power and
wasn't
the
a
hard
communist,
power.
right? Yeah,
Yeah,
like Lumumba
right.
wasn't a communist, and we did a whole
He
episode on
wasn't.
that, but that
Yeah.
was the smear campaign against Lumumba, was he was a communist, you know. So
Hmm.
so they're doing all of that, and they're is and Gerald Horne talks about the what was the compromise of 1954. Basically it's
Hmm.
kind of a tongue-in-cheek statement of saying, like, in 54 black leaders, and I even the history is honestly before 54, but he was like 54 was like the kind of apex of it, where black leaders are like, we're gonna advance things on the racial front, we're gonna kind of like fall back on the class front, and definitely on the international front we're not touching that. And you see a compliance of black leadership that doesn't deal with anything internationally, does deal with some class issues because they did come out of that struggle, so there was no way they couldn't talk about some of it. Like at least on the labor front, they had it because that labor was part of the movement. But like they kind of there's a retreat, as he says, from the class front and more of an embrace of the racial front and integration and representation and things of that nature. And there's different tendencies within that front, like,
Hmm.
some were more left leaning than others, but you know, they
Yeah.
primarily stayed out of it until like the mid 60s. You start seeing more of that lingo start coming back. People like Malcolm and others never let it go. But I'm just saying, like, you don't see that lingo on a mainstream front until like the mid 60s. And then we saw what happened to a lot of those leaders.
And a
So
quick question. And Gerald Horne also, when he talked about the compromise, a lot of those black leaders became part of the state. Is that
yeah,
correct? They're showing like
yeah,
CIA and
they either became a part of the state or they worked directly with the state, right?
mhm,
So, like, I mean, even Dr. King and Andy Young and all of them, I mean, they worked very closely with Johnson, but he's talking
mhm,
about even further back where, like, when Truman had those loyalty oaths,
mhm,
and the NAACP effectively adopts that loyalty oath within their organization and has their own internal purge,
yeah,
of communists throughout their organization,
yeah,
right? So, and they had a meeting with them because if you go, we again, this is all in our book, but the like mid 1940s, NAACP was actually was pretty soft on like the Soviet Union. They didn't have no beef with them, and they were
mhm,
talking about we should try to have peace with Stalin and all of this. And by like 1946 or seven, they've totally flipped the script, you know,
mhm,
and now they're purging communists and they're helping with the some members within it are helping with the prosecution of Du Bois and things of that nature, you know. So it was an interesting that was an interesting piece. And he also talks about how even um to some extent some civil rights groups like the NAACP use this kind of mood to force the United States to force some issues on the United States, so like the Appeal to the World Declaration, we charge genocide, those declarations that went to the UN, that were trying to use the idea of internationalizing the struggle to force some concessions at home. And then obviously Malcolm X eventually takes up that mantle even further, never is able to really complete it, but was very open about internationalizing the struggle. So trying to use that national security interest thing against them to force concessions, or in Malcolm's case, to try to actually get people to think about themselves as a worldly people and not just a domestic people, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's like a history of that. I don't want to get too much into this. There was another piece we had. I don't really remember what the name of that piece was. But it talked about there was early diversity initiatives in like elite colleges. So like Wilbur J. Bender, Harvard's dean of admissions during the Eisenhower years, published an essay that first appeared in the Harvard Alumni Bulletin, and eventually in the Boston Globe, Princeton Alumni Bulletin. In it, he presented a detailed critique of the impulse to institute a single factor admissions policy based strictly on academic criteria, which he called top 1% policy. Again, this is in elite places. And he says, in other words, my prejudice is for Harvard College with a certain range and mixture and diversity in its student body, a college with some snobs and some Scandinavian farm boys who skate beautifully, and some bright Bronx pre-meds with some students who care passionately, if unwisely, but who knows. So this was in the ethos, but it hadn't really been picked up, broadly by the state. But this sentiment of DEI, as we're showing, none of this is coming out of struggle. Like there's not a black leader of any persuasion that ever said, we demand diversity, inclusion, and equity. That never happened, like there was no black leader that ever said that, right? Even integration had more radical demands. Some of integrationists did have more radical demands than what we've come to understand it as. Like Malcolm jokes about sitting next to white people on the toilet. That's not revolution, but there were leaders that had more ambitious goals than that, but it gets reduced to that, right? So I don't know if anyone had anything to say on that before we get to the affirmative action part. I know we've been going forever already, but any reflections on that part?
Not for me. Yeah, no, I think that was a good summation. I mean, again, context, really briefly, if we're talking about the 1950s, which some of this is going on, this is also the time period where area studies becomes a thing in the colleges and universities. And people who may not know what area studies is, this is when you have an African studies department. This is when you have a Latin America studies department emerging. Then you start having Russia studies department, and these were all funded by either the State Department or the CIA. And they would, so academics would receive grants, not aware of it, to go and research, someplace in the continent of Africa. And what they were doing is, cheap intelligence, instead of sending
gathering information.
Yeah,
Even if they didn't know, they thought they were helping in some cases.
Yeah. And so this, those area studies emerge out of that, but this is going on at the same time as many of the things that, Two Black was just mentioning. So it's again, these are all happening. Other historical context while this is happening is another aspect of, the U.S. government is still conducting, experiments with syphilis down at Tuskegee, So I think the other important thing that I think
MK Ultra is happening around. Yeah.
And I think the other point that you mentioned, Two Black, and I just want people to sort of think about with these social contexts is that, not only are multiple things happening at the same time, but think about ways in which this is also representing how, government is not one entity, working, coherently, in one direction. They are rivaling interests, rivaling positions, rivaling strategies, as Two Black mentioned in terms of other areas, and so this is also part of that, where you can clearly see in certain departments they were trying to move in one direction, whereas another department they were doing something completely else. Yeah.
Yep, yep. Because like even a lot of what's funny is even with the Red Scare stuff, like Truman pushes the loyalty oath to try to show that the Democrats, it's just funny how these things float in cycles, that the Democrats were tough on communism. And that, now we hear about tough on crime or tough on immigration. So it's not that there was a grand plan necessarily, but the loyalty oath sets a tone because it's an executive order by a president. And then, so if you read about some of the later laws that got passed in that era, a lot of those laws, not a lot, some of those laws, Truman actually tried to veto. Like he didn't actually support them. And this is not to give him any credit, it's just to show the Rob Sewell's point. It's not always super coherent. So even though he helped set something in motion, he tries to correct an overreach that he helped set in motion. you know so it's like it's not absolutely coherent. Like when you look at the details, that was interesting. I think when I was reading CBS's book and I was looking over some of those laws, I'm like finding that Truman actually wasn't for all of them necessarily, even though he helps set some of these things in motion. And you find that sometimes that there's more aggressive entities. So a lot of that stuff was done. What was it, the House of the Un-American Activities Committee or something like the Hewitt. That was under the House. That's why the McCarthy thing I always found odd, because I don't think McCarthy actually did much. Talking about Joseph McCarthy, the Senator McCarthy, I don't think he actually was as deeply entrenched as some of these other entities, or even not Hoover. Like J. Edgar Hoover was way more anti-communist than even McCarthy was. So McCarthy is always an interesting term. But anyway, again, this is a show that, DEI, the way we're thinking about it again is just not as, it's the way we're talking about us more broadly as people think about it. We don't think about it in these forms. We just think it's this nice thing that's just supposed to give people opportunities, and white people are mad because of some kind of backlash and they're taking everything away from us. But it's like, that's not, as you can kind of see, and we're not even done. That's not necessarily the history. So now we get to affirmative action, which I think people start to more so associate with DEI, and there being a difference or not being a difference. They kind of intermingle here. I'm not going to read through all these laws or these executive orders, but Kennedy is one of the first to put it, I think, to put Kennedy, I don't need to name who Kennedy is. John F. Kennedy named in 1961 as an executive order. And that's where you actually get the term to take affirmative action to ensure, this is the executive order, to ensure applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to race, creed, color, or national origin. So you see here, gender is not actually in play. And when I was reading through the Minority Revolution book, he was actually making a point. It's not just a kind of general, I guess, will be a kind of abstract patriarchy that's part of it, but he was also saying that gender was not really a national security issue. So that's part of why you don't see gender in some of these earlier forms of like non-discrimination laws, because gender wasn't seen as a national security issue. That's the argument that he makes, right? So gender comes along
Makes
later.
sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
I see that. I see it.
Yeah.
And that's a great, I mean, again, you're bringing up a great point that he's bringing up, is to think about, there's a state logic that's operating, and, patriarchy doesn't operate off of a logic of, always thinking of let's do women wrongly, right? Like, and so in this case, his analysis is part of that, where, right, women are not included in this affirmative action point because when they're drafting affirmative action, they're thinking about ways to suppress, certain populations that either were dissenting or could dissent more.
Hmm.
How to deal with them. Because again, as Tupac was saying, women were not, as a sort of gender collective, some ambiguous gender collective was not a national security point, which is again a totally different way to think about
Yeah.
their exclusion on. And it makes, in some cases, when you think about an analysis like that, and it's such a good point, you start feeling bad for yourself of how you might have believed this was just sort of like
Hate.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then when it gets added in, it's a good thing, but then we had to critique that it was white women who first benefited, but again,
Hmm.
those are not the point. Like the point
Nah.
is it's about governance. Like
Hmm.
to govern better, and the whole point of governance is keep the money flowing. And so if you always think about that logic is operating, it begins to alter how you think about ways in which populations are discriminated or oppressed. They're not being discriminated or oppressed because there's a desire to discriminate and oppress. They're being discriminated and oppressed because that's a natural byproduct of needing a labor force, and a
Hmm.
surplus labor force,
Yeah.
continue to do all the work to keep the money flow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it kind of reminds me of some of our older episodes. Um, I think, actually, matter of fact, one of our older episodes that you were on, Dr. Russell, when you were talked about the idea of violence. They're not doing this because they hate you. There's a power aspect to it. There's a power dynamic that they're trying to get across. Um, I think you used the term pedagogical tool. Is that correct? And it makes sense because it's thinking like it's empire, thinking like an empire. Race, creed, color, national origin. Like you said, each one of these categories could be a demographic that could dissent. It could cause trouble for the
Yeah.
empire.
And he
So
even
you
makes
have
the
to
point.
put these
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
in. Sorry, I mean, I don't know. I'm almost done. I'm just saying basically you have to put this in the policy to make sure you say that this is what you're focusing on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
because national origin would be
Mm-hmm.
a group of people from Vietnam now in the
Mm-hmm.
creed would be a group of communists or
Mm-hmm.
whatever else in the in this country, or in terms of creed, thinking about religion, it would be a bunch of Zoroastrianism or Muslims, right? In this country, and then of course race. There's a bunch of black people, so these are they're seeing those groups as ways in which, one, they're dealing with these groups internationally in other contexts, based upon those areas, and they're trying to prevent that from also developing further inside the United States. Um, the causes tied to disability in women and age population, that's within that's maintaining or slightly altering how the state is operating, like forcing the state to either be more humane or less humane, right? But when it gets to race and creed and those things that they're trying to cover to prevent dissent, those are things that go beyond just forcing a state to be humane. That's changing the state, uh, because the current state wouldn't exist, anymore.
Yeah, he makes the point that the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act of he says that was also part of it because again, this is at a time you're fighting communism or whatever they call it, the Cold War. So at the time, the immigration was primarily leaned towards, like Europe and things of that nature, Eastern Europe. It was not really interested in bringing immigrants in from other areas of the world. And the Immigration Act of 1965 kind of like changes that where now you get immigrants from other places that we would now call quote unquote people of color or whatever. Like you get immigrants from all these different places. And he says there was no real movement for that act And he said that that's part of why he thinks that it was part of the national security concept, because there wasn't like the civil rights movement. You can at least say there was an insurgency on the ground to help bring that into fruition. With the Immigration Nationality Act, there's not really this major insurgency. There were activists on it, but not nearly to the extent of the civil rights movement. So he's saying that was all way of, brain drain. That was a way of, weakening, other countries that were emerging. Like there's different methods to, and there's also just needing workers, needing to expand, needing to add to the population, things of that nature. Like that was also a part of it. So it wasn't just this nice act to let more people in for the sake of it, right? Like that's not the origins of that either.
And, and for our listeners, just if you ask your family, if some of the families that are coming from Nigeria and Ghana, Trinidad, and Tobago,
Jamaica, yeah.
and Guyana and so forth, if they were coming in the 60s, this is because of that, because now the quotas were increased for countries in the continent of Africa, in the Caribbean, and South America, and Southeast Asia, because they had quotas for certain countries, how many would be let in. And what the act did, which was just basically open it up and made it normalized. So it was just as open as Germany. Guyana was just as open as Germany in terms of coming in to the country. And so it's literally 1965. And so while you have some people who are from these other countries before that, but you don't have major concentrations of those populations unless it's like New York, because
New York, yeah.
New York is just so big, but Miami is not even Cuban yet, right? So 1965 really sort of creates, some of the things that we think have always been there in certain cities, right? No, they emerge because of 1965, yeah.
Yeah. Just I thought that was a good pull putting that book in there, because that book gives some other, because I mean a lot of people have walked through this history of affirmative action and all that DEI, but he has some nuggets in there that I thought you don't see in a lot of the typical literature about this history. To just kind of close it or finish this part out. So really affirmative action didn't have any real teeth until Johnson. So it's not that affirmative action really starts before that, and you could find pre-origins of it, but the teeth of what we would now, I guess, call affirmative action and the so-called like quota thing that people complain about in relation to affirmative action was Johnson's executive order. And it's funny, this is the executive order where executive order 11246, he amended it to in 11375. The original order mandated federal contractors cannot discriminate against employees on the basis of race, religion, national origin, and then he amended it to include sex or gender, right? Like so, so it was amended in I think 67. But so that's to our point, was not even for Johnson, that was not original conception of how they thought about it, but it wasn't as simple as just a kind of you know like just hateful patriarchy. Not saying that's not a part of it, but I think maybe we should rethink how we consider patriarchy to not just be just about being mean just for the sake of being mean.
Right.
But by mandating that federal contractors ensure equal employment opportunity in their hiring practices, this is where these quotas start to kick in. And quotas, for people who may not know that history, is to say that instead of what we hear with DEI, where it's just like, we're going to try to hire more niggas. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, like that's kind of the policy. We're going to try to hire more gay people. We're going to try to have a program. We're going to try. And if we don't get it done, there's no, quotas, or no, we're going to make sure that, this much of our job labor force is this group. That's a quota, right? Like that this we're gonna allocate this much money to these people specifically. And so that kind of quota based stuff is what eventually gets struck down, which we'll get to. And then under Nixon, he has what's called the Philadelphia Plan. And he requires contractors in Philadelphia to hire minority workers under the authority of executive order. So really, Nixon requires it's under Nixon, interestingly enough, a Republican. He's the one that requires contractors to hire, minorities, quote unquote. It wasn't just take affirmative action to do it. It was actually, no, you have to hire these people. So the broadest expansion of affirmative action actually occurs under Nixon. Even that executive order was actually
Yep.
declared illegal, and he had to revise it because so again, but wait, while Nixon's doing that, and even Johnson and even Kennedy to some extent, the Vietnam War is happening, and they're sending black people, black men particularly over there to die. COINTELPRO is happening under each one of their administrations, right? You know, it's even escalated under Nixon. The law and order nonsense and the Southern strategy is happening at the same time that he's running on this, and he runs on black capitalism and such and things of that nature. There is a difference I think we should know in their versions of, like, I guess, affirmative action. I think this is not to defend one over the other, but it's just for the sake of history. When you read like Johnson's early kind of explanations of it, it sounds like more of a reparative kind of affirmative action, like in the speech he gave to Howard a few months before he passes the executive order. Howard University, it was a commencement speech. Said freedom is not enough, but freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now you're free to go where you want, as you desire, and choose the leaders you please. That's to say, like, you don't just say, okay, we repressed you for 400 years. Now just go about your way. Like, you have to actually make recompense. You have to do something about what's been done to these people. Nixon is like, he says, black extremists are guaranteed headlines when they shout. This was a radio broadcast, by the way, when they shout "bum" or "get a gun." But a bunch of black militants talk these days, actually, in terms of far closer to the doctrines of free enterprise than those of the welfarist 30s. Terms of pride, ownership, private enterprise, capital, self-assurance, self-respect, the same qualities, same characteristics, the same ideals, the same methods that the 2 centuries have been at the heart of American success, and that America has been exporting to the world. What most of the militants are asking is not separation, but to be included, not as supplicants, but as owners,
Yeah.
as entrepreneurs, to have a share of the wealth and a piece of the action. So his version of when he's trying to pitch to black people isn't really about looking backwards. It's about you want to be just as you want to be a capitalist too. You want to get in the action. You want a piece of the pie. It's not
Hmm.
really about this. The past has wounded you. How can we fix it? It's not. That's
Yeah.
not. You don't hear that in any of his rhetoric. You know.
And
So
Nixon was so calculated, equating black power with black capitalism as well, you know,
yeah.
sapping the radicalism from that term, it's no longer about critiquing or uprooting oppression. It just came about adjusting to it.
Yeah. Like he wasn't, he and so what you find in the lingo, and
Hmm.
this is important because once we get to how DEI like formally kind of gets brought into legal existence through the 1978 court decision, it shows how there was these different tendencies of how to think about affirmative action, and DEI as a more market friendly way won out over maybe a more Keynesian welfarist approach that Nixon is actually criticizing. Johnson comes out of that more Keynesian, and I know I'm throwing around words. That's a type of economics. John Keynes. So Keynesian economics was a kind of like basically a social democracy propped up by a war economy. And that kind of era of economics is the era that Nixon comes out of it too, but Johnson was a big proponent of that. So that's how you get the war on poverty and Medicare, like he comes out of that kind of social democratic history, despite all his racist, contradictions. So that's how they dealt with it. But in the late 60s, the state is kind of collapsing, particularly the government side of it. So as all of this is happening, there's a 1967, really even prior, but the riots of 1967 are, I guess, where you see it most prominently, even outside, even so, there's 150 riots emerged, and it was called the Long Hot Summer of '67. 150 riots emerged. And again, on our show, we don't think riots are bad things necessarily, so we don't need to clarify all of this. But riots emerged primarily in black neighborhoods. And this was from the book during the late 60s. This is from the Minority Revolution. Black urban disturbances rocked cities around the United States. These rebellions, frequently sparked by police violence, reached a fever pitch in July 1967 with massive disturbances occurred in Detroit and Newark. In the aftermath of that long, hot summer, President Lyndon B. Johnson's National Security Advisory Commission on Civil Orders, also known as the Kerner Commission, concluded that the rebellion stemmed from patterns of racism that splintered black and white into two separate equal societies. Yet many Americans view the rebellions as unlawful outbursts and misconduct. We're talking about post 1960s. Oh no, I think Russell added those notes. I did not see that. But there's also, because I'm about to read, that's in the 90s and the 80s and shit. What were you trying to get at there? I don't want to mess that up.
No, just in terms of civil disturbances coming back, around. And so, so those are, so 67, and then you have 68, and then you have the creation of the Kerner Commission to look at the riot, both in 67, but also the ones in 65 and 62. Several countries. And the Kerner Commission is actually recommending we need to have more youth programs and more recreation centers and things like that. But they completely ignored what Kerner, who was the chair of the commission, was going. They completely ignored him and they went with another particular route. But, the route that they took was attempting to suppress, these riots until they sort of switch strategies in the late 70s. So then when these other occurrences come out of nowhere, it's a shock to the systems. Miami, 1980, Los Angeles, 1992. Cincinnati, 2001. Most people kind of don't even know think about 2000, Cincinnati, but that is one.
That was a righteous one too, man. That one does not get enough attention.
And then this is why we can sort of think about why the repression was so strong, in 2020 to many of the protests that were coming on, because they're unlike us, they're aware of the history, and you can't allow something to happen, because if something happens in one place, it's going to be picked up into another place. And if it's 150 riots, be certain that those 150 riots were 150 because, when Cincinnati, rebelled or rioted, Cleveland, and Louisville began to sort of, think and respond, out of frustration about their conditions. And so, so these are just other moments in which there was a shock to the system because they had to quickly respond to it. To prevent it from spreading or becoming something like in the past.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. And it's like another term that came out of this that I had never heard before was this term called compensatory capitalism, which predates Black capitalism. So a lot of folks in their literature, they focus on Black capitalism, understandably. It's not a criticism, as like Nixon kind of trying to co-opt the movement or whatever of Black power, like you said, Ryan. That's true, but there was this kind of more quiet approach to that, of this business approach in affirmative action, even before Nixon, similar to how we talk about law and order and the war on drugs, and we tend to blame it on Nixon, even though a lot of that shit originates under Johnson and maybe even further back. But Johnson's war on crime lays a lot of the foundation for what eventually becomes the war on drugs and this bloated police state. That wasn't actually, that a lot of that starts under Johnson. Some of these business initiatives, much more, they were quieter, but that's how Democrats tend to move. So this is out of the Minority Revolution. He says the vast majority of Black business in Black neighborhoods, both industrial and retail goods services, were Euro-American owned and operated. Business leaders and Johnson administration officials heard little in the way of specific demands, talking about in regards to these these riots. The task at hand was to stop the rioting in the cities, restore order, and prevent damaging international propaganda showing the failure of American justice. So that goes back to the national security and all of that. Working separately and together, they developed various programs for empowering Black in poor neighborhoods that could serve as a riot control, special poverty aid, employment training, targeted recruitment, employment of ghetto residents, and various schemes that have residents, quote unquote, buy in to their community so they have incentives to preserve rather than burn down local businesses. So another thing that comes out of, you have those programs, but then Johnson's administration quietly used the Small Business Administration to funnel money to quote unquote minority business owners, primarily Black. Small Business Administration originates in 1953. But at this point, that was 65, and we're getting to 67. So it's in late 1967. Lyndon Johnson appointed Howard Samuels, an energetic New York entrepreneur active in the civil rights movement, to head it. Samuels develops rules to channel these subcontracts to quote unquote socially or economically disadvantaged persons, a formal broad category, but in fact targeted to help Blacks. He called the program compensatory capitalism. So then Congress helps the effort by giving the SBA, the Small Business Association Administration, funds for formerly colorblind efforts to help the poor that boosted its budget from 650 billion to 2.65, from 650 million to 2.65 billion in 1967. So Nixon, what's funny is that when you look at Nixon didn't really add any money to the budget. It was just rhetoric.
Right.
Like when you look at Nixon's Black capitalism, part of the criticism was he didn't actually put any money behind his shit. It was just him just naming it and kind of trying to court certain black entrepreneurs in the community. And that's why it never really was that successful. We look back on it, I think, as being more successful than it actually was, because a lot of people really weren't even messing with it like that. But in the Johns, go ahead.
No, I mean, go ahead and finish your point. Yeah.
No, I'm just saying in Johnson's case, they, as you see here, specifically 650 million to 2.65 billion, that is a material improvement. And again, I'm not advocating for one over the other. I'm just saying this might have actually been more effective.
Yeah.
And even when we think about Black business today, I think often you'll hear the Nixon, Black capitalism, but compensatory capitalism, which you don't never hear that term. And again, I hate when people put words before capitalism. It's capitalism, right? But I'm just saying, like, this compensatory capitalism of there being some kind of like you're trying to again repair, that goes to that reparative type of affirmative action, is, you see how these things actually kind of merge together. So DEI has a way of trying to act like it's making up for historically disadvantaged people and all of that, but it's still like a very market friendly logic at the same time. Like it kind of merges these things together. But Johnson helps usher in this Black business shit, and just as much as Nixon, if not more.
He lays the framework down.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say that, again, we mentioned earlier how soft power and hard power are two, different strategies, that, yes, they complement each other, but definitely you have certain sort of factions and so forth pushing for one or the other. But instead of thinking about liberal and conservatism, think about the fact that there are people who are pushing for order and there are people who are pushing for justice. So order and justice become these 2 points where it's not Republicans are in order and Democrats are in justice. You have a mixture. And in fact, some now sources are reevaluating whether or not, people have been overestimating Republicans' conservatism, during the time period when more evidence shows literally that more Republicans were trying to push for these justice-based programs, instead of where the majority was going, which was order. And this is not to sort of give, somehow Republicans some benefit of the doubt. It's just to sort of show how these strategies always have tensions. I mean, it's always planned. There's never one narrative in one direction that is everything is going in. neither one are technically good, for our conditions because they're not technically really attempting to truly, address, our conditions. Again, this is about maintaining power, not doing service, So I just want to kind
Yeah.
of that sort
No,
of.
that's important because I think people think that the Republicans voted all against the civil rights bills, and that's not actually true, especially when, some of these horror shows happen in terms of people getting assassinated or you know, girls getting bombed in churches like this. That did actually move some of them to the other side. And the Republican Party that we know, Republican Party was a party of it was a business friendly party at the time, very business friendly. But the kind of just overt racist Republican Party that I think people popularly think of the Republican Party as today, that just is starting to happen in the period we're talking about, that Southern strategy that Nixon applied, where they try to take the Dixiecrats and recruit them into it. And that didn't really fully come to fruition until Reagan, you know. So to Russell's point, that hasn't fully even evolved to that scale yet, right? Because you had like Barry Goldwater was in '64, he got mollywopped by Johnson, right? They wasn't even, I think Johnson won almost every state, So it's like that was a Republican Party has those tendencies. No one's arguing for either one of these parties. But it is
Right.
important to note that it wasn't as simple as this kind of binary that we're in today, where people think of the Republican Party as like the white people's party, and the Democratic Party is some kind of diverse party
Mm-hmm.
that might have problems, but it still is a better path or whatever. Like that's how people, I guess, generally people who are into that binary, that's how they conceive of it. A lot of people are obviously tired of both parties for their own reasons. Um, On to Nixon. It says he had an executive order to the Small Business Administration, particularly consider the needs of interests of minority-owned businesses. But again, he didn't really add any money. He also had the Office of Minority Business Enterprise, but there wasn't really a lot of like it was just a lot more rhetoric than it was him throwing any money at it. And the book even notes how a lot of leaders didn't even rock with him. I think McKisson, who was in core, rocked with Nixon on this, and a few others. The Urban League a little bit, but overall, he didn't really get a lot of support from the quote unquote black community. There were just some black capitalists, famously or infamously James Brown, you know, and people like that kind of rock with Nixon and got caught a lot of flack for it. What was his name that was in the Rat Pack? The black guy.
Sammy Davis
Uh,
Jr.
Yeah.
yeah, Sammy Davis Jr. rocked with him, but he was a Republican for a while anyway. But generally he didn't have like the community on his side in the way that Johnson did. Now Johnson doesn't run for re-election in '68. Humphrey runs, loses, and that's a whole other story we don't need to get into. So all that's happening again. So like we keep noting, all these things are happening all at the same time. Now I referenced earlier the Heritage Foundation. I think we can also quick time out. We could just close on the Bakke decision. I don't even think we need to even touch the rest of this, or we'll be here all night. So once we get through the Bakke decision, we can close out because we've said so much. The rest of it, people can just go read the piece because this is more than enough for 2 parts. But
I, you
so
know, I
anyway,
I actually interned as a high school student with James Parsons.
oh really?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hilarious.
Hmm.
He was old and decrepit then. I mean, I didn't know who he was. I just remember working in his office and seeing all these pictures of him with John F. Kennedy and like, who the hell is this old ass dude? Because it wasn't no Google.
Eh,
It wasn't no Google.
right.
Then. I couldn't be
Right.
working and then like let me look him up. I was like, and then Encyclopedia didn't have that on him because he had just been doing stuff for the past whatever amount of years. But yeah. Whenever I see James Parsons, I always remember like, damn, I was working for him
Wow.
all summer.
Yeah, that was one of the few positive examples we had in the piece. Even though he eventually, I think you noted, lost his,
Yeah, right.
you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, so something when I was talking about the Heritage Foundation and their history, in their piece, The Radicalization of Race, Philanthropy, and DEI, I'm not gonna quote too much from it, but they make a case, interestingly enough, their history of DEI, and this is where people are gonna have to just read our piece because we can be here forever. Because one of the arguments we're making kind of implicitly and not so implicitly is that the kind of the weakness of DEI feeds the right in the ways that everyone is so scared of. The weakness of DEI, the way it demobilizes people, feeds the right, and we mean that even in the fact that people don't want to critique DEI because they feel like it's a way of hating on black people or whatever. So when you read their history of DEI does deal with some of the stuff we've discussed today. It doesn't deal with it in the same way. We totally disagree with their kind of interpretation or arc of history, but they do get into some of this stuff, like going back to Kennedy and Nixon and even Roosevelt and such. They don't just treat DEI like it just pops out of the air. They
Yeah.
did do some research. Go ahead.
Well, that's more like, I mean, I was just going to say that's like actually more academics because when you go into the DEI sort of actual companies or the trainers and so forth, they don't have it, they don't have a history, right, at
No,
all. And so
no.
they may reference points that have happened during these time periods, but they don't even connect it to the development of DEI,
Mm.
so DEI itself, you know, doesn't have a history. So when people are talking about even trying to defend it, they can't like, harken back to some period of how it was developed as a means to sort of legitimize it in the present day. Different people may try to, Frankenstein a history. Uh, but yeah, so it's also another interesting point because I think there was also a video circulating of people, who were, I guess, national, representatives of DEI in some type of way, and they were all talking in, vague sort of feelings or concept ideas and philosophies. They were never talking about, a history, and of course, they were never talking about any material conditions, but they definitely, again,
No.
were not talking about any sort of history. But yeah, go ahead.
No, that's important because when you read the again, people can read it on their own, but they're quoting. I mean, they go as far back here, in 1935, the former Secretary of War. They don't even have secretaries of war anymore because that's again the State Department emerges and the Department of Defense and all that. That also didn't used to exist for the record, but the former Secretary of War, Newton Baker, who was then a member of the Board of Trustees with Carnegie Corporation, suggested that the Executive Committee give consideration to general question of Negro education, Negro problems, which meant consideration of financial grants. That grant that Baker suggested in 1935 eventually funded one of the most influential books on race relations in America, An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy by Swedish economist and sociologist Gunnar. I never can say this man's name right. Gunnar Myrdal, is that how you say it?
Yeah, Murdoch.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so it's like, you'll hear this, you read little stuff here and there, but they're very critical. Again, we don't have time to get into it. They even talk about how in 1903, Booker T. Washington had provided 600,000 to or excuse me, the Carnegie Foundation provided $600,000 so Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, a historically black university. So there's been a long history of white philanthropy funding black causes. Where we differ is we don't find that to be a positive thing, or we don't find that to be more, I guess, to put it more aptly, a radical thing where they're trying to steer people towards some kind of communist revolution or something. No, this is a way, as we argue, to actually thwart movements, and this is a form of soft power.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but also all those things are not technically really building towards DEI. It's like them sort of picking out past circumstances in which the military is integrated, the
Yep.
post office integrated, as
Yep.
if as if those are all
This
coherent.
marching, yeah,
Yeah, that
yeah,
were like continuations of the other to build up to eventually, DEI comes into fruition. And no, that's not true. These are things
it,
that were happening completely sort of disparate of trying to build a future, DEI sort of
right.
idea concept, at all. What we're talking about is literally what people were articulating and how they were picking up things from a previous sort of administration or previous regime, you
Without
know.
a sense of the future, like
Yeah.
knowing it's gonna crystallize. Yeah, and that's what the right. I mean, the right's not the only one, but they cherry pick history. But I'm just saying, what's frustrating when you read it is it's like they're referencing things that we might reference for different reasons. But when you read a lot of this liberal shit, like you said, they don't even want to deal with that because these are the people who fund them. They don't even so it creates a vacuum where they can tell that history and people have never heard it before and be like, "Oh my God, you mean Rockefeller is where we get DEI?" Because these fools don't ever want to like critique anything. They don't like I'm talking about these liberals and some of these so-called leftists or whatever, they don't want to deal with it. So it just becomes a vacuum for them to fill in that history because I mean, there's not a lot of content. It's hard to find. It's getting easier now because it's just easier to find information. But I remember when I was in college and it was very difficult to find like funding sources of anything, particularly this kind of stuff like this in the history of it and where it came from and how did these people even pay for their daily bills. There was no sense of where it came from, so they go and look up that history, cherry pick it, make it seem like there's some like Machiavellian agenda that's been marching for that last 150 years since slavery, to try to build up to this DEI that's taking away this stuff from white folks, but they don't write it in this extremely hostile language, which so you makes it's understandable why people get drawn into it. And since there's not a lot coming from the other side, people just defend the bootleg rehab, as we say. This is what you end up with. Um, so I found this study to kind of counter that because like we talked a lot about government, but there is a private and DEI primarily does find itself now in the private sector, whether that's private for profit or private in a nonprofit sense. That's primarily where DEI is expressed. It does, and even when it's coming through government, it's usually a grant to a private entity now. It's not really the government itself. It's here's federal dollars to do something, and you hear about some nonprofit getting that money to do something that's quote unquote DEI related. Um, but there was this study that I found interesting because some people, have these arguments about radical or whatever, but it was called Black Radicalization and the Funding of Civil Rights, 1957 through 1970 by Herbert Haynes. And this was done in the mid 80s, actually. Um, and he had talked about, the basic argument was people were making that the more militant groups, people would say, were organizations were weakening the argument of the civil rights movement or the Black Power movement by engaging in activities that weaken its legitimacy. And his argument was that actually it strengthens the bargaining position of the moderates, and brings in more funding to the moderates. Um, and it reminded me of a Malcolm X quote. He said if Malcolm X used to do that on purpose, right? He said he would go down to the South and talk crazy so people would take Dr. King more seriously because they didn't want to deal with the alternative. He said if white people realize the alternative is perhaps they would be more willing to hear Dr. King. Right? Like that was that was the kind of and even Coretta Scott King, she said on Malcolm X, he said he wanted to present an alternative that it might be easier for whites to accept Martin's proposals over hearing from him. I didn't understand him at first. He seemed rather anxious to let Martin know he was not causing trouble or making it difficult, but that he was trying to make it easier. Later in the hallway, he reiterated he seemed sincere. So he was attempting to, not that he agreed with Malcolm or with Martin, but he understood this dynamic that when we say they're all devils, all of a sudden Martin Luther King becomes way more reasonable. You know, when we say, take back the land, all of a sudden Martin Luther King's position is strengthened. Like Malcolm just kind of realized that intuitively, but someone did a study on it. He didn't quote Malcolm, and it was called the positive radical flank. So this kind of shows, even when we're thinking about DEI, how the moderate positions are strengthened actually by the black rage, by the more radical things. So what he tried to do was track as things got more radical in the 60s, where did the where did the money go? What organizations received it? And was there more money overall that went into the movement? So his definition was a flanking strategy in both military and business contexts involves targets on opponents' weakest points or areas where they are less focused rather than directly challenging them head on. It's a bargaining position. So he looked at this study, or he couldn't find all the numbers because again he's working in the 80s. So someone honestly should redo this study because you'll probably find even more numbers. So if you see here the chart, some of y'all are listening, I'll describe it for even for y'all though. These are acronyms, and he ranks this from left to right is from most moderate to most radical. The New Urban League, excuse me, the National Urban League is the least radical, and that's still true today. And then the NAACP, which fluctuated depending on what era you look at, but by its 1970 was
Facts.
firmly moderate. The
Legal defense.
Now the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and then the Southern Regional Council, and then the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and then SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. A lot of acronyms. So he judges each organization. I won't go too long because I don't want to get too data driven, but for those who are, just to give people a sense of, as militant activity went up, you can actually see the money go up. So if looking as far on the right corner here where it says total movement income, and you see in 1957 the total income he could find for the entire movement of these, and that just means all these organizations put together was $823,000. By 1970, there was almost $21 million. Right, within a 13-year period that was on. So then you look at as like, so you can think about like in 1967 when Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, comes out and says Black Power, 1966, excuse me. And you see the SNCC at their height in 1965 had 637,000 here under SNCC, and you just see their money gradually go down. Then they got 397,000, then they have 250,000, then they have 150,000, then they have 50,000, they have 25,000 in their entire, that's all the money they got. But then you can look at the Urban League and it's the exact opposite. Like 1965, they have about 1.8 million, 1966, 2.2, 1967, 2.8, 1968, 3.9 million, 1969, 8.6, and by 1970, they have 14 million. Right. And you can see the same thing for the NAACP. The numbers aren't as high, but they go in 65 and 388,000. By 1970, they have 2.6 million. And you can just track this. The only anomaly here is CORE, but if you read like Robert Allen's Black Awakening and Capitalist America, they got a donation from the Ford Foundation in 1969, and that's why it goes in 1967. You see or 1967 to 68, they have 280,000, 250, and then all of a sudden you see them get 670,000. That's because they embraced Black Power, but then the Ford Foundation turned Black Power into Black business, and that's why you see that jump. And then after that, it goes back down. So you can see the scale, and he has two other charts I won't get into, but they deal with movement income as well, and you can see how the things literally declined over time, but it strengthened the position of the more moderate organization. So what that doesn't just play out in this kind of black space, that's just true in general. Right? It's not just about black organizations. The more radical movements or the more radical organizations strengthen the bargaining position of moderates in general, to the point that I would even argue that's how we get a DEI. right? Because it's like the same effect. That's where the money flows. It's a great study here. And again, he wasn't even able to get his hands. He admits in his own methodology, there's certain numbers he didn't even get a hold of. So there's
Well,
probably more money.
well, perhaps, I mean, remember we opened this up with talking about, at least the 90s as being the sort of start, the early 90s being the start of diversity trainings, right? And so if 92 is the LA riots, that kind of matches up, right? Um, Post LA riots, you begin to sort of see this emergence of, it takes a village to raise a child, diversity training, you know, um, and people, of course, in those diversity trainings talking about the plight of Black people more so first, because those were the first sort of trainers or consultants.
Yeah, and even in 2020, like again, the numbers are very clear. We document that in our own book. Like, racial equity funding went up 3 times. It was from, I mean, it's already at a major scale of like 5 billion. In 2020, it's at 16.5 billion. Diversity related jobs went up and by 55% in 2020. And I was looking even back further. There was a major explosion in DEI under Trump the first time, like in terms of funding. There's a major explosion under Trump in terms of all those different programs. And I think we all can kind of intuitively tell that when we looked out in the world around that time, there was way more of those initiatives at the same
Hmm.
time. So it's like, again, there's a strong correlation with where this stuff goes. But again, it tends to strengthen the moderate position. So in Malcolm's case, he's like, at least the moderate position does something for us because it's Dr. King. You take out King and the moderate position is, Abernathy or Andrew Young or somebody, like it weakens it. So we're in a situation now where even and I think we also put this in our book too, in thinking about funding Black Lives Matter, if you follow this kind of like logic of the positive radical flank, not saying Black Lives Matter is radical in my sense, but I'm saying Black Lives Matter helped raise money for groups that did even less. So so the NAACP and the Urban League, who didn't have been doing anything, raised more money, and we did cite that raised more money than Black Lives Matter. Black venture capitalist funds got more money than Black Lives Matter. As much as people were mad at them for the 90 million, the people that at least went out in the streets and protested and did whatever, strengthened the position of groups that did nothing. And this is also true just on a class level, which we point out in laundering, that when the masses of people go out in the streets, it strengthens the bargaining position of the Black elite who have done nothing to get a promotion or something. So
Hmm.
like this is a interesting of just cause and effect in general of how it doesn't. So when they act like when y'all talk like that, y'all gonna get somebody killed. Like we get you paid, we don't get you killed. You know, like, like, like
You
if we're
take out the
being
word
totally honest,
radical. You take out the word
yeah,
radical and put an intelligent in.
yeah.
That's
So
an inside joke. We'll explain.
so yeah, so I'm just saying like it's an interesting kind of like context to think of in terms of just like again, we talked about the government side, but this private, and he did track federal dollars too, so that was part of the funding mechanisms that he looked at. But it just shows you that that's another way to think about laundering is how a position is strengthened that is less committed to struggle. So lastly, and then we're done. Because is so we've worked through soft power, we've worked through a kind of earlier history of what kind of becomes, the national security, affirmative action. But as all this is happening, like we've discussed, there's all this repression happening as we just demonstrated, the movements are getting bought off. SNCC basically was dissolved at that point because of their activities. So the people who are doing some of the most radical work are being sent to prison and all of this. But these things still live on. So by the time we get to 1978, a lot of those folks are gone. And that's where we get this case, the Regents of University of California versus Bakke. Um, and that is a case, just to give a quick breakdown and kind of where it comes out of. That's at the University of California, Davis, or what we would say UC Davis. And it was the School of Medicine, the UC Davis School of Medicine, that was founded in 1968. And they had an all-white graduating class. And like Rasul was saying, a lot of people are just picking stuff up. So they're like, all right, we need to do something about that, because that was directly in response to the riots happening. Because another thing he notes in a Minority Revolution, he's like, it's not just that riots were happening in the cities; they were happening on university campuses. So universities had a very, direct interest in making sure that didn't happen to them. It's not just, oh, it's just happening kind of in the ether. No, they might burn down, whatever hall is down the way, right? So,
hmm
Man, I mean,
so
68 is Columbia,
yeah,
University,
yeah,
and Howard University, and then it goes over to San Francisco State University, and yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
So yeah, so the threat of black rage wasn't just something that happened in quote unquote urban ghettos, as maybe people think about, because a lot of these folks were also either trying to get on campus or were on campuses as well.
hmm
So there was a so they just so UC Davis. So I was interested in reading about how a lot of these medical programs are led by these different associations, like these different organizations that were associated with, the American Medical Association and stuff. Like a lot of them were the ones proposing quotas to the universities themselves, because they wanted to have those people in their ranks. So
hmm
UC Davis has a graduating class they thought was going to be 50. It ended up being 100. And they said we're going to have 8 slots. Once it gets to 100, they said we're going to say 16 slots automatically go to so-called minorities, no matter what. That means that there is no projections, or it's just like, no, out of the 100 slots, 16 goes to minorities. So there was like 200 something, 270 something white people applied. They never got into that 16, but they felt like, but black people were able to apply for all 100 and to the
hmm
16, and so were other minority groups at the time. So there's Alan Bakke, which I looked into his history a little bit more after we did that episode. He was a Marine vet. He was actually he was in Vietnam. He became an engineer that worked for NASA. So by the time he started to apply for medical school, he was actually in his like 30s. And back then, applying for medical school in your 30s was not like, that sounds regular to us now. That wasn't normal. Like, schools literally would discriminate against you because of your age.
hmm
So what was interesting is a lot of what Bakke couldn't get in school originally. He tried to get Northwestern and other places because he was just too old. But instead of suing for like what his real claim should have been, age discrimination,
Right.
he decides to sue for racial discrimination. I think that I never really caught that. Like, he didn't have to sue for it. He could have just said, I'm not getting in schools because they're saying I'm too old. Because he's like 32, 33 years old at the time.
hmm
Because he had went to war, been a vet, worked at NASA, now he wants to be a doctor. Back then, that wasn't like what we call non-traditional students. That wasn't a thing back then, right? So he could have won. I mean, eventually the discriminating against age was knocked down anyway, but he could have just sued on that, and we would have never even had this case. But when he gets rejected from UC Davis, he talks to the assistant dean, and the assistant dean's dumbass says, he actually refers him to two lawyers who are working on affirmative action. And he says he just did this. The assistant dean said he just kind of did it as in passing. He didn't actually think dude was gonna pursue it. And actually, that dude actually got fired, the assistant dean, because of this story. So Bakke goes and works with these lawyers and takes this shit to court and wins in California, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. And because the school was arguing that he didn't even have the right to sue because he was a private individual, and at the time they were saying only institutions or something would have the right to sue or something like that. So the regents of University of California, to kind of, to sum it up, there was an interesting split where there's 9 judges in total, but there were 6 different opinions, and there was what was called a plurality decision. There wasn't a consensus on originally. There was no consensus on this situation because he sued saying, I applied for the school. I have higher grades than the black people who got in. He said this is a violation of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Opportunities Act, and I should be allowed in. And it's not fair that I have to get in the other 84 slots, and there's 16 slots already made for them because he had been getting rejected all this time. So the court was split on whether they agree. So Lewis Powell, who also wrote the Powell memo, for those who might be familiar with that, um, he split it where he was like, I disagree with the quota aspect of this, right? He doesn't agree that there should be 16 slots made for minority groups. He felt like that was a violation of the 14th Amendment, excuse me. But he did say that race should be it's okay to take race into consideration for the diversity of a classroom. He claimed the government had a compelling interest to promote diversity in the classroom. So when he wrote his opinion, the folks who were totally for affirmative action, including quotas, like Thurgood Marshall and others, I think Brennan, I believe, were all on there. Even made a case that it's just interesting reading it. They even made a case that the 16 that quotas should be thought of like athletic scholarships, which is an interesting thought just to think about a different way of conceiving it. But ultimately they lost, so they parlayed with Powell to get to the 5-4 decision. And so what was weird was all justices technically agreed with Powell to some extent. They were like, we either agreed with his rejection of quotas or we agree with him in the diversity aspect. And then that is what lays the framework for diversity and affirmative action to continue, but to continue more so under the framework of quote unquote diversity and not as this, as we talked about earlier, this reparative type of thing where we're going to deal with the history of what's happened to you or whatever. It's like, no, it's a more market friendly approach that the world should be reflective of everybody in it. Like we were reading that Harvard dean earlier who was saying the same thing. So Powell eventually sides with them. Supreme Court sides with them. Is the end of quotas. That's probably that small period where affirmative action actually was quotas was the most progress any black people made into the middle class probably in American history. uh, and once they got rid of quotas, it never quite worked to that scale. But that lays the framework for, again, we what our piece gets into in terms of DEI serving neocolonialism and neoliberalism, how it serves globalization, because expanding empire required you had to have different diverse groups, and it wasn't just black people; it was women, right? It was LGBTQIA groups. It was people with disability. It was other quote unquote minority groups like Latinos or Asians and things of that nature. And you needed to have those people on board to pursue profit, to pursue imperialism to some extent. um, but that's the verdict that really lays the framework. Again, we can go further and we have more, but we've been on here forever, so I'll end it here. But I'm saying if there's more thoughts, people can add them. I'm saying like that's the kind of history. So from there, a lot of what Rasul lays out at the beginning of this episode or beginning of these two episodes, a lot of what he lays out in terms of DEI in the 80s and 90s is following this 1978 decision. Yeah.
Yeah. And the wording that Powell uses is the retroactive sort of term that these consultants and trainers sort of adopt. So when he uses divert, that's why that term then is lifted and is the first sort of term in this sort of barrage of different sort of letters. It's because it was trying to invoke that as if, to extend that. So just like the classroom is going to be diverse, so should our nonprofit programming, so should universities, in the administration, so should corporate entities, so should city government. So again, that's the actual wording is also from this sort of the reporting that all the justices sort of provide afterwards. And so, yeah, just want to kind of just mention that as well.
Yeah, and that the Workforce 2000 is one thing I will cite because I think it speaks to the private sector. This was again in the Heritage Foundation. People probably think I'm about to become a Trumper now, but again, research requires you to read everything. But they concluded this was out of the Heritage Foundations. This is their quote that the number of white men in the workforce would decline and women, minorities, immigrants in the workforce would rise significantly, as would the demand for skilled workers. In order to prepare for this future, employers needed to reconcile the conflicting needs of women and families, integrate Black and Hispanic workers fully into the economy, and improve educational preparation of all workers. What's funny is the Heritage Foundation actually supports this kind of DEI. Their argument is that it went too far and it was radicalized and all this. They said that there's a logical reason to say, hey, the world is getting darker basically, and we need to accommodate these people for our own kind of business interests. But it shouldn't get to a point where, we're doing all the stuff that we're doing now and all this identity politics and cultural Marxism and wokeism or whatever, right? Like when you read after that excerpt, that's basically the case that they make is that it got out of hand or whatever. But DI does complement this kind of globalist idea of like the world is getting darker and we still have to be able to have access to these markets and we need these different groups. We can't just have white men to have access to these markets. Right, like it still complements that and that whole like 2045 that the world is going to be a majority, the United States is going to be a majority minority and whites will no longer make up the majority of the population, which I always found funny because I think that means is just that people of color, whatever, again, using this category very loosely, will be the majority put together, and then white people will be a minority to people of color, quote unquote. But people of color are not our actual demographic. So, so I always found like we don't share necessarily the same politics, common history. Like people of color is a made up term. It's more of a marketing term than it is an actual thing that people experience. So, so it's not really majority minority. It's just that white people won't be the majority in combination over the entire quote unquote people of color, right? Like, and DEI is a way to teach all the dumb white folks not to say nigga, not to be offensive, and then when you expand it to all the other kind
Right.
of categories, knowing pronouns and understand like all of this is just not ways to not get sued, ways to have a better entry points in the communities and understand them. It's just the DEI is highly ineffective because a lot of communities, especially working class communities of any color, race, creed, whatever, does not even know half of this lingo. So so when white folks walk in and try to start talking to Latin people about Latinx or something, it's like they don't even know what you're talking about at the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember like when I talked to older gay folks who had never heard of anything about pronouns and stuff. And again, I'm not knocking this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just saying a lot of these things do not come from the grassroots.
Right.
So
Right.
like it's not a lot of black folks weren't talking about, even when I was growing up, niggas wasn't talking about privilege like that. Like it wasn't a term we really said very often. That became more in the lexicon as we started getting online and stuff like that. So that's what I'm saying. A lot of this language is kind of imposed or
Privilege.
dropped in. It's not how we understand our experiences. I'm not saying we have some inherent magical understanding of our experience either. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that's just not, it's not organic to where a lot of people were coming from, and it becomes the language that we use to understand. And now all black liberals say white supremacy. I remember when I was in college, I won't use a person's name, and I remember I sent them a Black Agenda Report article because Black Agenda Report always said white supremacy, and they were like, I don't know if I'd say white supremacy, but, I don't know that's like the Klan or something, right? Like that was their understanding, right? Now everyone calls everything white
Everything.
supremacy,
Yeah.
you know.
Yep.
So, so I'm just saying, like people appropriate this stuff, don't know where it comes from, whatever. And now but a lot of this comes out of this
Man.
corporate boss HR speak, right? It's not an organic it's not organic to like where folks really are coming from in their experience. I don't think I that's my opinion. I don't think it is. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Privilege, the black body, abolition,
Oh man.
decolonization. You can
Not
just go
black
on down a
body.
list of all of these. Man.
Yeah. Um
And what I've gathered is, again, to my point, black is directly responsible for the crackdown at Ball State. I was kidding. But anyway, but yeah. Yeah, man. How you
soft
want to
power.
close up? Hmm. So what'd you
No,
say?
I just it's soft power, but yeah, at the end of the day, like I hope
Hmm.
people read the piece because we said more on our more contemporary conditions. Like the piece speaks
Hmm.
more, but like most things on this show, we go so far back, we never get to anything in the times that we've actually lived in. Um, so we barely got to that part other than some of those
Hmm.
trainings that Rasul had to sit through when he was younger. But yeah, but yeah, the general point is just like this is not something that necessarily deserves defend. You know, the idea of just in general of people being like accepting diverse groups and caring about like, yeah, of course, why not? But, that's not what this is. It has very like it has very welcoming language that makes it easy to
Hmm.
hop on the boat. And then when you say that this is bullshit, people think that you're rejecting the idea of diversity in and of itself in the abstract. Like I just don't like people or something, And that's not what this is. So,
Right. Right.
and it's definitely not a radical, it does not. So, anyway, any other words people have to say? We can get off here.
Nah. Honestly, I think that we did a great job of dispelling the myth that DEI has any tinge or any little bit of a microcosm of radicalism. And I think we just did a good job going through the history to contextualize everything that's happening right now. And I think you should go back in the article that saying like, everybody go check out bootleg rehab, still laundering black rage on Black Agenda Report to get a if you want to do any more reading about DEI, how it's full of shit, basically.
Yep, yep,
And well,
yep,
that's
and
it.
yeah, yeah. And there already kind of is. There will be another acronym that will merge that
Hmm.
people will get attached to,
Hmm.
and and they'll say this is the new thing, and because corporations and government is lazy, they'll start appropriating it, and until the actual movements built to counter these kind of things, this is the world we're living in. So that's just what it that's just what it is. So be prepared for them to take that, and yeah. But
Hmm.
it's not at the core, this is not addressing people's material conditions. This is not dealing with the problems that people face. This as our piece lays out, and I don't want to get into that because we're trying to get off here, but this does not get, this actually has helped promote, kind of like we said with that whole bargaining position thing, it as you shift things further right and shift and weaken things down, you are strengthening the bargaining position of honestly pretty terrible people. So to continue to be terrible people because they can stand in as the group that, represents the quote unquote marginalized group, and it just becomes a hustle at that point. So anyway, good episode, good set of episodes, however this comes out. Thanks Rasul for filling in for our burgeoning parents on this show. and go read the piece, and we'll be back again. All right, peace out.
Peace.
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state.